Rain hangs in the air outside a roadside motel. Turn the parking lot into a mirror for a flickering neon sign. Headlights sweep across wet asphalt and vanish down the highway. Inside a ground floor room, a fuzzy TV glow fills the silence. A curtain shifts with each passing car, and a candy wrapper rests on the nightstand beside a small shoe. The door is locked, the windows are shut, and nothing looks out of place. Then the bed is empty. No crash, no broken glass, no footprints that make sense. Just a missing child, a quiet hallway, and a town about to search every shadow it never used to notice. The night did not announce itself as important. It arrived the way most nights do in small towns off forgotten highways, quietly and without ceremony. Rain clung to the air, not enough to storm, just enough to dampen everything it touched. The asphalt outside the motel reflected the glow of a single flickering neon sign, its letters buzzing softly as if tired from years of doing the same work over and over again. Cars passed occasionally on the road beyond, their headlights stretching briefly across the parking lot before vanishing into darkness, carrying strangers toward places that would never remember this town by name. Inside one of the ground floor rooms, the world felt small and ordinary, the kind of ordinary no one thinks to document. A television murmured low, its signal fuzzy, the volume just loud enough to fill the silence. A thin curtain shifted slightly whenever a car passed, moving like a slow breath. A child sat on one of the beds, legs swinging absent-mindedly, fingers sticky from a candy bar bought earlier from a vending machine that rattled louder than it should have. There was laughter, brief and soft, the kind that doesn't demand attention, the kind that disappears as easily as it comes. Nothing about the room suggested danger. The door was locked. The windows were shut. The world outside felt far away, held back by glass and thin walls. This was a place people stopped when they were tired, when they needed rest before continuing on. A place meant to pause life, not end it. No alarms rang. No instinct screamed. Time moved forward without resistance. Somewhere between one ordinary moment and the next, something irreversible happened. No one can say exactly when the silence replaced the sound of that child's presence. Not down to the minute, not even down to the hour. There was no single noise that marked the shift, no scream tearing through the night, no crash of breaking glass. Just a quiet absence that settled in unnoticed at first, like a shadow stretching as the light slowly fades. When the room was checked again, the bed was empty. At first, the absence didn't feel like a threat. Children wander. They explore. They slip into hallways and parking lots driven by curiosity that doesn't understand danger. The assumption came easily, because it always does. The idea that this was temporary, explainable, reversible. A door opened. A name called softly at first, then louder. The parking lot was scanned. The ice machine stood silent. The glow of the soda machine illuminated nothing but spilled gravel and damp concrete. Minutes passed. Then more. The air changed. Panic doesn't arrive all at once. It builds in layers, each one heavier than the last. The voice calling the child's name began to crack. Footsteps quickened. The rain seemed louder now, tapping against metal railings and pooling in shallow dips along the pavement. Every passing car became both hope and fear, each set of headlights briefly promising answers before leaving only more darkness behind. There was no sign of a struggle, no marks on the door, no open window. The room remained exactly as it had been left, frozen in its ordinariness. A candy wrapper on the nightstand, a small shoe near the bed, the television still glowing, unaware it was now the only witness to something unspeakable. By the time the front desk was alerted, the night had already begun to harden into something colder. The motel clerk, half asleep moments earlier, stepped outside and joined the search, shining a weak flashlight into corners that offered nothing back. Names were called into the dark again and again, the sound bouncing uselessly off walls and cars in the empty stretch of road beyond. Somewhere in that moment, the night stopped belonging to itself and became something else entirely. It became a before and an after. Police were called. Radios crackled to life. Doors were knocked on. Guests emerged, confused and irritated, unaware that they were stepping into the opening chapter of a story that would outlive them. Flashlights swept across shrubs and dumpsters and the narrow strip of grass, separating the motel from the highway. Tires hissed against wet pavement as patrol cars arrived, red and blue lights, slicing through the darkness in harsh, rhythmic pulses. Still nothing. No footprints that made sense. No witnesses who had seen anything more than passing cars. No stranger remembered knocking. No shadow recalled moving through the lot. The motel stood there quietly, offering no explanation, its walls absorbing questions without returning answers. As the hours stretched on, the idea that this was a simple misunderstanding began to collapse under its own weight. Children do not vanish into sealed spaces without leaving something behind. Yet here, in a place designed for temporary safety, one had done exactly that. Dawn crept in reluctantly, the sky turning from black to a dull gray that revealed just how exposed everything truly was. The parking lot looked smaller in daylight. The surrounding area felt less mysterious, less capable of hiding anything at all. And yet the child was still gone. By morning, the town began to wake up to the news. It traveled fast, slipping into conversations at gas stations and kitchens, whisper over coffee cups and morning routines. A child missing, taken from a motel room in the middle of the night. The words didn't sit right. They clashed with everything people believed about where they lived and how safe it was supposed to be. For the family, time fractured. Every second stretched unbearably long, each one carrying the same question with no answer. The mind replayed the night again and again, searching for the moment when something could have been done differently. Every sound remembered too late. Every assumption now poisoned by hindsight. The motel room was sealed off, transformed overnight from a place of rest into a place of scrutiny. Officers moved through it carefully, their presence heavy, respectful, uncertain. They cataloged what they could, though there was little to catalog. Absence does not leave fingerprints. Silence does not bleed. Outside, traffic continued. People drove past without slowing down, unaware that a mystery had settled into this unremarkable stretch of road. Life, indifferent and relentless, moved forward as it always does. But for those standing in that parking lot, watching the light change and the rain finally stop, the world had already shifted in a way it never would again. No one said it out loud yet, but the fear had already taken shape. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a child wandering too far. This was something else. Something that did not belong to daylight or reason. The night had swallowed a child without a sound. And whatever truth lay behind that silence was still waiting, patient and unseen, just beyond reach. Before that night, the town existed in a comfortable state of certainty. It was the kind of place people describe with simple words that carried unspoken pride. Quiet, familiar, safe. Nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen there, and that absence of drama became its identity. People left their doors unlocked during the day. Children rode their bikes past sunset. Strangers were noticed, yes, but not feared. The town believed in itself, and belief, when shared by enough people, can feel like fact. The motel sat on the edge of town, close enough to be claimed, far enough to be ignored. Most locals had no reason to step inside it. It was a place for travelers passing through, for truck drivers needing rest, for families stopping short of somewhere better. From the outside, it blended into the scenery. Low buildings, faded paint, a sign that hummed quietly at night. It did not carry a reputation, and in a town like this, that meant everything. Danger was something that happened elsewhere. Big cities. Late-night news stories. Names no one recognized. Morning light revealed a town struggling to process a thought it had never practiced. Police cars remained parked near the motel, their presence drawing curious glances from passing drivers. People slowed down, pretending not to stare, their minds filling in the blanks with guesses that made them uncomfortable. A child gone, not lost in the woods, not run away, taken or vanished, or something worse that no one yet wanted to say. Conversations shifted in tone. At the diner, voices dropped lower. Words like missing and motel didn't sit well together. Parents looked up more often, their eyes searching for familiar faces that should have been there. Teachers paused during lessons, distracted by the knowledge that one desk will remain empty, not just a day, but possibly forever. The town had always measured safety by routine, by how predictable each day felt. When routines break, fear rushes in to fill the space. People began to retrace their own movements, not because they were involved, but because they needed reassurance. They remembered locking doors, checking windows, watching their children sleep the night before. The question wasn't asked out loud, but it lingered everywhere. If it could happen there, why not here? The motel became a symbol overnight. What had once been invisible now drew attention from every angle. Some people blamed it immediately, as if a building could carry intent. Others defended it, insisting that places don't do things, people do. But beneath those arguments was something deeper and harder to admit. The town had never really considered what existed at its edges. Strangers were no longer neutral. They were scrutinized. Anyone who didn't belong stood out in sharper contrast. License plates from out of state were memorized. A man walking alone became suspicious. A woman asking for directions was remembered longer than she should have been. Trust, once freely given, now required proof. Yet for all the unease, there was also denial, a collective refusal to accept what the disappearance implied. People reassured each other with familiar phrases. Children wander. There must be a simple explanation. The police will figure it out. These statements weren't meant to convince others. They were meant to keep fear from settling too deeply inside. The town's police department was small, accustomed to handling disputes that ended in handshakes and paperwork. They knew the residents by name, knew which houses belonged to which families, knew who drank too much and who argued too loudly. A missing child was not something they were trained to carry alone. Still, they tried to project confidence, because that's what the town needed to see. Search efforts expanded. Volunteers gathered, forming lines that moved through nearby fields and ditches. Flashlights returned to the night, sweeping across places no one had bothered to look at before. The act of searching became communal, almost ritualistic. People wanted to be useful. They wanted to believe that effort alone could fix what had gone wrong. But as hours turned into days, and days stretched further, exhaustion set in. Hope, once loud and insistent, grew quieter. It didn't disappear all at once. It thinned, diluted by the lack of progress. Each morning without news made the silence heavier. Children noticed a change before adults admitted it. Playgrounds emptied earlier. Parents hovered closer. Bedtime stories took on an edge of urgency, as if reading aloud could protect against something unseen. The town's identity began to shift, subtly but permanently. Safety was no longer assumed. It was negotiated. The motel owner spoke to police, answered questions, replayed the night again and again, searching for anything that might help. Guests were interviewed, their memories fragmented and uncertain. No one recalled anything definitive, just impressions. Shadows, sounds that could have meant anything or nothing at all. And that was the most unsettling part. The disappearance hadn't torn through the town with chaos. It had slipped in quietly and settled there, changing the way people looked at familiar streets. The grocery store felt different. The sidewalks felt longer. Even the silence at night felt heavier, as if it were hiding something. There was a moment, brief and almost unspoken, when the town came together in shared grief. Candles were lit. Names were said out loud. Promises were made to remember, to help, to never let this happen again. But unity, like shock, is difficult to sustain. Over time, life demanded attention. Bills needed paying. Work resumed. Normalcy crept back in, incomplete and uneasy. Still, the town was no longer the same. It carried a fracture beneath the surface, a knowledge it couldn't unlearn. Every child who walked home alone became a reminder. Every unfamiliar car reignited old fears. The belief in absolute safety had been replaced by something more fragile, vigilance. Years later, people would struggle to explain how everything changed without appearing to change at all. The streets remained. The houses stood. The motel continued to rent rooms to travelers who knew nothing of what had happened there. But for those who lived in the town when the child disappeared, there was always a before and an after. They learned that safety was not a permanent state. It was a story they had told themselves. And like all stories, It could be interrupted. The disappearance didn't just take a child. It took certainty. And in its place, it left a question that would echo through the town for decades, unanswered and unrelenting. For the family, time stopped obeying its old rules the moment the child was gone. Hours no longer moved forward in a straight line. They stretched, collapsed, repeated themselves. Every second felt weighted, as if the air itself had thickened. The world outside continued to function. Cars drove past. Phones rang, people spoke, but none of it felt real anymore. Reality had narrowed to a single unbearable fact. The space where their child should have been was empty. In the days before the disappearance, life had been unremarkable in the best possible way. Arguments over small things. Laughter that filled quiet moments. A sense of routine, so steady it felt permanent. These memories became both comfort and torment. The family replayed them endlessly, searching for meaning where none had existed at the time. Every choice felt suspect now. Every decision begged to be judged through the cruel clarity of hindsight. Sleep became something to fear. Closing their eyes invited images they couldn't control. Parking lots, motel hallways, the glow of a television in a dark room. When sleep did come, it was shallow and fragile, breaking apart at the slightest sound. Nights were the worst. Darkness felt complicit, as if it knew something they didn't. Each passing hour without news deepened the dread that something irreversible had already happened. They learned quickly how hope could hurt. At first, it surged at every possibility. A reported sighting, a phone call from police, a rumor overheard by a stranger who meant well. Each time, hearts lifted, breath held, only to be dropped back into the same pit of uncertainty. Hope, once a refuge, became dangerous. It raised them just high enough to feel the fall. The family's home transformed in quiet ways. Objects associated with the child became sacred, untouched. A jacket left draped over a chair. Shoes by the door. Drawings taped to the wall. These were no longer just belongings. They were proof, evidence that the child had existed, that this loss was real and not some cruel misunderstanding that would resolve itself with time. People came and went, offering sympathy in voices that grew awkward as days passed. There were casseroles left at the door, carved with careful handwriting. Phrases repeated so often they lost their meaning. We're praying. They'll find them. Stay strong. The family nodded, thanked everyone, performed gratitude while feeling completely hollow inside. Grief made them spectators in their own lives. Blame crept in quietly, disguised as questions. Should they have checked the door again? Should they have noticed something earlier? Should they have chosen a different place to stay? These thoughts arrived uninvited and refused to leave. Even when reason said there was nothing they could have done, guilt insisted otherwise. It whispered late at night, relentless and cruel. The world became divided into two groups, those who could leave and those who were trapped. Friends eventually returned to their routines. Co-workers went back to work. Conversations drifted back to ordinary topics. For the family, there was no return. Every conversation ended in the same place. Every thought circled the same unanswered question. Where's my child? Birthdays came and went. At first, they were marked with tears and candles that burned without celebration. Later, they became days to endure rather than acknowledge. Time moved forward regardless of readiness. The child did not age in memory. They remained exactly as they were the last time they were seen, forever suspended in that moment. The strain on the family was immense. Grief does not distribute itself evenly. Each person carried it differently, and those differences created distance. Silence replaced conversation. Anger flared unexpectedly, often over nothing at all. Love remained, but was buried under exhaustion and sorrow. The disappearance was a constant presence, sitting between them at every table, in every room. They clung to the idea that someone, somewhere, knew something, that the truth existed, waiting to be uncovered. This belief was necessary for survival. Without it, the void threatened to swallow everything. They learned to live with uncertainty not because they accepted it, but because there was no alternative. Media attention came and went in waves. Cameras appeared briefly, capturing their faces in moments of raw vulnerability. Their pain became something to be consumed, discussed, forgotten. Each interview reopened wounds, forced them to narrate their own tragedy again and again. Still, they agreed, hoping exposure might bring answers. Hope, despite everything, refused to die. At night, they imagined scenarios they could never fully articulate out loud. Some were fueled by optimism, others by terror. The mind filled in gaps with images that felt real enough to hurt. Not knowing was its own form of torture. It denied them both grief and relief, trapping them in a permanent state of waiting. Years passed, but the waiting never ended. It became a background hum, always present. Even moments of laughter were followed by guilt. How could joy exist alongside such loss? The family learned to compartmentalize, to function outwardly while remaining fractured inside. They visited the motel once, standing in the parking lot longer than necessary. The building looked smaller than memory suggested. Ordinary, unremarkable. That was perhaps the most painful realization of all, that something so devastating could originate from a place so plain, so forgettable. They spoke the child's name every day, sometimes aloud, sometimes only in thought, saying it felt like an act of resistance against erasure, as long as the name existed. So did the child. They refused to let time turn a life into a statistic. What the disappearance took from them could never be fully measured. It altered their understanding of the world, of safety, of love itself. It taught them that loss does not always come with an ending. Sometimes it arrives and stays, settling into the spaces between moments, shaping everything that follows. And even as years stretched into decades, one truth remained unchanged. The love they felt did not fade. It endured, heavy and unyielding, anchored to a question that still had no answer. From the outside, the investigation appeared to begin immediately. Police cars arrived. Officers asked questions. Notebooks filled with observations and names. But beneath the surface, something crucial was already slipping away. Time. In cases like this, time is not just a measure, it is evidence. And from the very beginning, it was being lost in small, almost invisible ways. The first assumptions were gentle ones, shaped by familiarity and comfort. Children wander. They get confused. They hide. The idea that something intentional had occurred felt too heavy to place on the situation so early. Officers searched nearby areas, scanning ditches, fields, and alleyways with the expectation that the child would be found frightened but unharmed. That belief guided everything that followed, narrowing the focus before the full picture could emerge. Paperwork moved slowly. Calls were made, but not urgently enough to shake surrounding jurisdictions into immediate action. The motel room was inspected, but without the intensity reserved for scenes already labeled as crimes. Evidence was noted, but not all of it was preserved. Some details, harmless on their own, would later feel unforgivable in hindsight. The town's police force was small and deeply rooted in routine. They knew how to handle disturbances, thefts, disputes between neighbors. A disappearance of this nature challenged the limits of their experience. Yet pride, quiet and unspoken, kept them from asking for help as quickly as they should have. Admitting uncertainty felt like admitting failure. Officers questioned guests one by one, their memories already blurring as hours passed. People struggled to recall the ordinary, the sound of footsteps in a hallway, the presence of a car that didn't belong. Without a clear sense of urgency, these fragments slipped through fingers like water. Each delay dulled their sharpness. The motel itself resisted clarity. Its layout offered too many possibilities and no definitive answers. Doors led open air. Hallways stretched without cameras. The parking lot allowed entry and exit without record. The environment favored anonymity, something that would later feel painfully obvious. As days passed, the narrative hardened around early beliefs. The search expanded outward instead of inward. Forests were combed. Bodies of water were checked. Flyers were printed and taped to windows and lampposts. The child's face stared back at passers-by, frozen in a moment before everything went wrong. The family watched all of this unfold with a growing sense of dread. They asked questions that had no satisfying answers. Why wasn't this treated differently? Why did everything feel so slow? Officers offered reassurances, but reassurance without progress felt empty. The distance between procedure and desperation grew wider with each passing hour. Leads came in, but they were scattered and contradictory. A woman thought she saw a child near the highway. A truck driver remembered a figure by the vending machines. None of it could be confirmed. Each lead consumed time and energy, pulling attention further away from the motel itself, where the disappearance had begun. By the time outside agencies were contacted, crucial hours had passed. Evidence that might have spoken clearly had been contaminated by movement, by weather, by people who didn't yet understand the gravity of the situation. Doors had been opened, rooms cleaned, footprints erased by rain and traffic. The investigation became reactive instead of proactive. Instead of shaping the narrative, officers chased it. Each new theory tried to compensate for the lack of concrete evidence, building structures on unstable ground. Confidence eroded quietly. Questions multiplied. Answers remained elusive. Internally, frustration grew. Some officers sensed early on that something wasn't right, that the simplicity of the initial assumptions didn't match the reality they were facing. But doubt stayed unspoken, buried beneath hierarchy and habit. Challenging the narrative felt risky. It required admitting that mistakes had already been made. Public pressure increased as days turned into weeks. Media coverage returned, asking harder questions. Why no suspects? Why no progress? The town watched as its protectors struggled, unsure whether to offer support or demand accountability. Trust wavered, subtle but significant. The case files grew thicker, but clarity did not. Notes contradicted each other. Timelines shifted as memories changed. The investigation became layered with uncertainty, each layer making it harder to see the truth beneath. For the family, every update felt like another disappointment. They learned to read between the lines, sensing when optimism was forced. They began to realize that the system they had trusted was not built for this kind of absence. It functioned best when there were clear paths, clear suspects, clear endings. This case offered none of that. Behind closed doors, officers replayed decisions, wondering what might have been done differently. But hindsight does not rewrite the past. It only sharpens the pain of knowing that certain moments, once past, cannot be recovered. The investigation did not fail all at once. It fractured slowly, piece by piece. Each missed opportunity, each delayed action, compounded the next. By the time the full weight of the disappearance settled in, the ground beneath the case had already shifted. What remained was a search defined as much by what hadn't been done as by what had. A case haunted not only by a missing child, but by the quiet knowledge that time, so critical, so unforgiving, had been allowed to slip away when it mattered most. The motel room stood still while everything else moved around it. At first glance, it looked untouched, preserved in a state of bland normalcy that felt almost offensive given what had happened. Beige walls, a patterned carpet worn thin in places where countless feet had passed before. 2 beds made with identical covers, their fabric rough beneath the fingertips. Nothing screamed for attention. Nothing offered an explanation, and that, more than anything, made the space unsettling. Investigators stepped inside expecting something. Anything that would tell them how a child could vanish from such a confined place. A force lock, a shattered window, signs of panic frozen into the room. Instead, they found quiet, the kind of quiet that refuses to answer questions. The door showed no damage. The lock worked exactly as it was supposed to. The windows were intact, their screens undisturbed. Even the air felt neutral, as if the room itself had no memory of what had happened within its walls. Every object was examined with care, though care felt insufficient against the enormity of the mystery. A candy wrapper on the nightstand suggested comfort, normalcy, routine. A small shoe near the bed felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of the entire case. The television sat dark now, its earlier glow replaced by silence. It had been on when the child disappeared, a detail that lingered in the minds of those trying to reconstruct the night. Noise had existed, light had existed, and yet none of it had prevented what followed. Investigators traced imaginary paths through the room. If the child left on their own, which way would they have gone? The door led directly outside, into a parking lot exposed to passing cars and the open road. The bathroom offered no hidden exits. The window, though possible in theory, made little sense in practice. It opened to a narrow strip of ground, visible and unremarkable. Nothing about the layout supported a simple explanation. The room became less a crime scene and more a paradox. The tighter the focus became, the more impossible the disappearance seemed. It was as if the child had dissolved into the air, leaving behind only fragments of a life interrupted. Officers photographed every angle, measuring distances that felt too short to matter and yet suddenly carried enormous significance. The distance from the bed to the door, from the door to the parking lot, from the parking lot to the road. Each measurement forced them to confront how quickly something could happen, how little time it might take for a life to slip beyond reach. Despite their efforts, the room resisted interpretation. It did not reveal a story. It refused to point fingers. It simply existed, indifferent and unchanged, as if daring anyone to explain it. Over time, this resistance became personal. The room seemed to mock the investigation, offering itself fully while keeping its secrets intact. As hours turned into days, the room's significance grew. It became the center of the case, the point to which every theory eventually returned. No matter how far the search expanded, no matter how many leads pulled attention outward, the truth had to pass through this space. And yet the room remained mute. Cleaning staff waited for permission to return, their routines disrupted by the weight now attached to a place they had once entered without thought. When the room was eventually released back into use, the decision felt wrong to some, necessary to others. Life, after all, does not pause indefinitely. New guests arrived unaware, slept in the same beds, watched television in the same silence. The room absorbed them without comment. For the family, the idea of strangers occupying that space was unbearable. The room had become sacred and cursed all at once. It was the last place their child had been seen, the last place that held even the faintest possibility of answers. Knowing it had returned to anonymity felt like another loss layered onto the first. Investigators revisited the room repeatedly, hoping distance might reveal what proximity had hidden. Each return carried the same result. No new clues, no sudden revelations, just the same oppressive normalcy. The room refused to age with the case. It did not degrade, did not change, did not confess. Over time, the motel itself seemed to shrink around that room. Other spaces faded in importance. Conversations always circled back to it. The room became shorthand for the entire mystery. Mentioning it was enough to summon unease. People avoided staying there once rumors spread. Others stayed deliberately, driven by curiosity they would never admit out loud. The room taught investigators a difficult lesson. Not all mysteries announce themselves through chaos. Some are defined by how cleanly they erase themselves. The absence of violence, the lack of disorder, made the case harder, not easier. It stripped away familiar patterns, leaving nothing to follow. As the years passed, the room remained unchanged in memory even as the motel aged around it. Paint was refreshed, furniture replaced, but the outline of that night lingered, invisible but indelible. Those who knew the story could feel it standing outside the door, could sense the gravity pressing inward. In the end, the motel room did not explain what happened. It did something more unsettling. It demonstrated how easily something terrible could occur without leaving a mark. How a place could witness everything and still say nothing at all. As the initial shock faded, something more corrosive took its place. Uncertainty. When answers fail to arrive, the human mind fills the silence with speculation, and in a small town, speculation spreads quickly. It moves through conversations, through glances held a second too long, through the subtle shift in how neighbors greet one another. The disappearance no longer belonged only to the family or the police. It belonged to everyone, and that made it dangerous. Names began to surface, not because of evidence, but because people needed them to. The idea that no one was responsible felt unbearable. So attention turned outward, then inward. Travelers who had stayed at the motel that night were scrutinized first. Their faces were described and redescribed, their movements reconstructed from fading memories. A man who left early in the morning. A woman who seemed nervous. A truck that idled too long in the parking lot. None of it held up under closer examination, but it lingered anyway. When outsiders failed to provide answers, suspicion turned local. Familiar faces suddenly felt unfamiliar under the weight of possibility. People who had lived in the town for years found themselves questioned, watched, evaluated in ways they never had been before. Innocent behaviors took on sinister interpretations. Someone who kept to themselves. Someone who had once raised their voice. Someone who didn't attend the candlelight vigil. Small differences became magnified, transformed into imagined motives. The family felt this shift acutely. At first, they were surrounded by support. Over time, that support thinned, replaced by quiet distance. They noticed the way conversations stopped when they entered a room, the way questions were asked with just enough hesitation to sting. Grief made them vulnerable, and vulnerability made them targets. Some people, intentionally or not, began to wonder if the truth was closer than anyone wanted to admit. Rumors are rarely born from cruelty alone. Often, they grow from fear. The town wanted to believe that the danger had a face, a name, something that could be isolated and removed. The alternative, that the disappearance could not be neatly contained, was far more frightening. So stories took shape, filling gaps with imagination. Police followed leads as they emerged, aware that ignoring them would only deepen distrust. Interviews were conducted, alibis checked, lives temporarily disrupted. For those questioned, the experience was jarring. To be suspected of something so terrible, without proof, left scars that never fully healed. Even when cleared, the shadow remained. The investigation walked a fragile line between necessity and damage. Each new suspect offered the illusion of progress, a brief sense that the case was moving forward. When those leads dissolved, frustration intensified. The cycle repeated itself, wearing down both investigators and the community. Media coverage amplified everything. Stories simplified complex realities into digestible narratives. Faces were shown on screens with implied questions. Speculation was framed as possibility. Viewers far removed from the town consumed the story as entertainment, unaware of the ripples their curiosity created. Inside the town, trust eroded quietly. Long-standing relationships shifted under the strain. People became cautious with their words, aware that anything could be misinterpreted. The sense of community that had once felt unshakable began to fracture, replaced by guarded interactions and unspoken suspicions. The family watched this unraveling with mixed emotions. On one hand, every theory meant someone was still searching. On the other, each false accusation felt like another injustice layered onto their grief. They wanted answers, not scapegoats. But desperation blurred that distinction for many. As time passed, the list of suspects grew longer and less defined. Possibilities replaced people. Anyone could fit if viewed from the right angle. The absence of evidence allowed imagination to run unchecked. The case became less about facts and more about fear. Eventually, the whispers grew tired. New events demanded attention. New stories replaced old ones, but the damage remained. Relationships never fully returned to what they had been. Some people left town, unable to escape the weight of association. Others stayed, carrying the quiet knowledge that once suspicion had found its way into their lives. The disappearance had introduced a new kind of awareness. That safety was not just about locking doors or watching children closely. It was about how quickly trust could collapse when certainty disappeared. The town learned this lesson slowly, painfully, through the loss of its own cohesion. And still, beneath all the speculation, the truth remained elusive. The whispers had not brought clarity. They had only added noise. The mystery endured, untouched by rumor, waiting patiently while doubt did its damage. Time did not heal the absence. It only learned how to move around it. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the disappearance slowly lost its urgency in the eyes of the world, but it never loosened its grip on those closest to it. The case slipped from headlines to archives, from daily conversations to quiet recollections triggered by anniversaries and chance reminders. What remained was a persistent ache, dull but constant, woven into the fabric of everyday life. The investigation officially continued, but its rhythm changed. The frantic pace of early searches gave way to long stretches of silence. Case files were reorganized, revisited, and eventually handed off to new detectives who knew the story only through paper and photographs. Each transfer felt like a small erosion of intimacy. The child became a name in a folder, a face frozen in time, a case number waiting for attention. The town adjusted in subtle ways. The initial fear softened into something quieter, more manageable. Parents still checked locks, still glanced at their children a little longer before bed, but the sharp edge of panic dulled. New routines formed around the absence. People learned how to live alongside the unanswered question without letting it consume every moment. The motel continued to operate, its rooms filling and emptying with strangers who knew nothing of the past. The neon sign flickered on and off each night, indifferent to memory. Over time, renovations softened the building's worn edges. Fresh paint covered old walls. New furniture replaced what had once been there. To an outsider, nothing about the place suggested it had ever held such weight. But for those who remembered, the knowledge lingered beneath the surface, invisible but undeniable. The family marked time differently now. Each year without answers became its own milestone. They learned how to function in public, how to answer polite questions without breaking apart. Privately, the grief evolved. It became less explosive and more enduring, a steady presence that shaped decisions and outlooks. They no longer expected sudden breakthroughs, but they never stopped hoping for them. Birthdays were acknowledged quietly. Holidays carried an undercurrent of loss that never fully faded. Empty chairs were noticed. Traditions adjusted. Life continued, but it did so unevenly, shaped by what was missing rather than what remained. The town's children grew older. Some left for college. Some started families of their own. A new generation emerged with only vague awareness of the disappearance, something they had heard about but never experienced. For them, it was history, not memory. This shift was both painful and inevitable. Time does not pause to preserve relevance. Detectives occasionally revisited old leads, driven by instinct or newly surfaced information. Advances in technology offered possibilities that hadn't existed before. Evidence was re-examined. Files reopened. Each renewed effort brought a flicker of anticipation that was carefully guarded against disappointment. Experience had taught everyone involved to temper expectations. Some tips came in years later, sparked by memories that had lingered too long to be ignored. A conversation overheard long ago, a detail that suddenly felt important. Most of these leads faded under scrutiny, but their existence served as a reminder that the case was not entirely forgotten. Somewhere, someone still cared enough to speak. The family learned how to live with uncertainty without surrendering to it. They became experts in endurance. They learned how to carry grief quietly, how to smile without guilt, how to exist in a world that had moved on. Their love did not diminish, but it adapted, finding new ways to express itself through remembrance and resilience. Occasionally, something would pull the disappearance back into focus. An anniversary, a similar case reported elsewhere, a chance mention in a conversation. Each time, the wound reopened just enough to remind everyone that the story was unfinished. The town itself changed. New businesses opened, old ones closed. Faces came and went. But beneath the surface, the disappearance remained part of its identity, a silent chapter that shaped how people understood vulnerability and trust. It served as a quiet warning, passed down through cautious behavior rather than spoken words. Years became decades. The child remained forever young in photographs and memory. The case existed in a strange state, neither active nor closed. It waited, not with urgency, but with persistence. And then, without warning, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to disturb the stillness that had settled over the mystery for so long. A reminder that even after years of silence, the past is capable of speaking again. The moment the case stirred again did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It came quietly, almost apologetically, the way truths often do when they have waited too long to be noticed. It began with something small, so ordinary it nearly passed without comment, a routine action, a task completed out of habit rather than intention. The kind of thing that happens every day without consequence, until one day it does. Years had layered themselves over the disappearance, settling like dust over files and memories. The motel had changed hands more than once, each new owner inheriting not just a building but a history they only half understood. Renovations had come and gone, altering surfaces but never touching the weight beneath them. For most, the past existed only as rumor, an uncomfortable story attached to a place that still needed to function. During one such change, something surfaced that had never been meant to disappear. It was not dramatic at first glance. No hidden chamber, no sudden revelation, just a detail that didn't belong where it was found. Something overlooked because it hadn't been recognized for what it was. Something filed away, dismissed, forgotten. When it was noticed, it produced an immediate discomfort, the kind that settles deep in the chest before the mind fully understands why. Those involved hesitated, uncertain whether they were seeing significance or projecting meaning onto coincidence. After so many years, caution had become instinctive. No one wanted to raise false hope. No one wanted to reopen old wounds unless there was reason. But once the thread was pulled, it refused to let go. Old records were retrieved, their pages yellowed and brittle, carrying the faint scent of age. Names long forgotten resurfaced. Timelines were compared against one another, and for the first time in decades, something aligned in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. A gap that had once seemed meaningless now appeared intentional, an absence within an absence. Investigators who had inherited the case leaned in closer. Fresh eyes often see what familiarity overlooks. What once appeared irrelevant now felt heavy with implication. Questions emerged that should have been asked long ago, but weren't, either because the moment passed too quickly or because no one thought to look in that direction. The realization was slow, unfolding piece by piece. It didn't arrive as a single shocking truth, but as a growing sense that the story everyone thought they knew had been built on incomplete foundations. The motel, once considered only a backdrop, began to feel central again, not as a place of chaos, but as a place of control, of routine, of access. The discovery forced investigators to confront uncomfortable possibilities, not about strangers passing through, but about familiarity, about proximity, about how easily trust can obscure danger. The idea sat heavily, resisted at first, then reluctantly acknowledged. For the family, the call came without warning, a request to talk, a careful tone that carried more weight than reassurance. They had learned to brace themselves, to protect against disappointment. But something in the way this was presented felt different. Not hopeful, not desperate, focused. As pieces came together, the past shifted shape. Small details once dismissed as inconsequential took on new meaning. A timeline that didn't quite fit. An interaction remembered but never fully examined. A decision that now felt less like coincidence and more like design. The truth had not been buried deep. It had been left in plain sight, obscured by assumption. It waited patiently, knowing that time, eventually, would change the way people looked at it. As the investigation quietly reignited, those closest to the case felt a mixture of dread and anticipation. Answers, when they finally arrive, rarely bring peace the way people imagine. They carry consequences. They demand reckoning. Police reviewed actions taken decades earlier, aware that any revelation would reflect backward as much as it moved forward. Silence had protected many things. Now it threatened to expose them. The town felt the shift before it was officially acknowledged. Rumors returned, different this time, less frantic, more careful. The tone had changed. This was not speculation. This was something else. A slow realization spreading through whispered conversations and cautious glances. What unsettled people most was not the possibility of learning what happened, but the implication that the truth had always been within reach, that the mystery had not survived because it was unsolvable, but because no one had thought to look in the right place. The discovery did not answer every question. It didn't erase the years of waiting or undo the damage done by time, but it did something just as powerful. It reopened the door the case had closed behind itself, allowing light to fall across places long left in shadow. And as that light spread, it revealed a truth that would soon leave everyone involved struggling to find words. When the truth finally surfaced, it did not arrive with relief. It arrived with weight. Heavy, crushing, irreversible. The kind of truth that does not close a wound, but exposes how deep it always was. For those who had spent decades circling the mystery, the realization unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the mind itself resisted accepting what had been hiding in plain sight. It began as a pattern rather than a confession, a convergence of facts that, once aligned, could no longer be separated. Timelines that once seemed messy now fit together with unsettling precision. Movements that had been written off as routine now carried intention. Familiarity, once a comfort, revealed itself as access. The most devastating part was not what had happened, but how close it had always been. The story everyone had told themselves for years had depended on distance. A stranger, a passing shadow, someone who came from the outside and disappeared just as quickly. That narrative allowed the town to grieve without implicating itself. It allowed the family to believe that what happened was random, cruel, but detached from their everyday world. That belief did not survive the truth. What emerged instead was something far more difficult to face. The realization that the danger had not arrived under cover darkness from somewhere else. It had already been there. It had known the layout, the routines, the blind spots. It had blended seamlessly into the background of ordinary life, unnoticed because it belonged. Police reviewing the case felt the ground shift beneath them. Years of work, assumptions, and dismissed details rearranged themselves into a new picture, one that rendered earlier conclusions painfully inadequate. Statements once considered unimportant now read differently. Decisions that seemed reasonable at the time felt catastrophic in retrospect. There was a moment, quiet, unrecorded, when the realization fully set in. A pause in conversation. A look exchanged between investigators who understood simultaneously that this was not just a breakthrough. It was an indictment of process, of trust, of the belief that familiarity equals safety. No one spoke for several seconds. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel insufficient. The truth reframed the motel entirely. It was no longer a neutral setting where something inexplicable occurred. It became an environment shaped by routine and opportunity. A place where presence did not raise alarms, where movement did not attract attention, where access did not require force. That understanding rippled outward, altering every memory associated with the case. Moments once recalled with neutrality now carried menace. Interactions replayed in the mind with new context, revealing how easily warning signs can hide behind normal behavior. For the family, hearing this truth was like losing their child all over again, not because of what they learned, but because of what it meant. The randomness they had clung to, the idea that this was an unpredictable tragedy, was replaced by something more disturbing. This was not chance. This was proximity. And proximity is personal. Grief shifted into something sharper. Anger surfaced, not explosive, but focused. Directed not just at one person, but at a system that had allowed assumptions to override scrutiny. At a community that had looked outward instead of inward. At a truth that had waited decades to be acknowledged. There was no satisfaction in being right. No sense of victory. Only a profound exhaustion that came from knowing the answer could not undo the past. Police found themselves grappling with more than just evidence. They were confronting the consequences of missed questions and delayed instincts. The case was no longer defined by mystery alone, but by accountability. How many opportunities had been lost because the truth did not fit the expected narrative? How many years had passed because it was easier to believe in an outsider than to question what felt familiar? The revelation spread carefully, deliberately. Officials understood the damage such knowledge could cause if handled recklessly. This was not just about solving a case. It was about reshaping an entire story that people had lived with for decades. When the truth became known, reactions were subdued but intense. There was no collective gasp, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there was a quiet reckoning. People sat with the knowledge, letting it settle, realizing how deeply it challenged their understanding of what happened and of themselves. The town felt smaller under the weight of this truth. Familiar places took on new meanings. Memories were reevaluated. Conversations replayed. Silences reconsidered. Trust, already fragile, fractured further under the realization that danger had not announced itself because it didn't need to. What left police speechless was not just the identity of the truth, but its simplicity. Not because it was obvious, but because it revealed how complexity can be created by looking in the wrong direction for too long. The answer had not been buried beneath layers of deception. It had been standing still while everyone else moved past it. There were no words that could adequately bridge the distance between then and now. No apology that could restore lost time. No explanation that could fully satisfy the family's grief. The truth did not bring peace. It brought clarity. And clarity, in this case, was its own kind of burden. It forced everyone involved to confront a reality far more unsettling than the mystery itself. That sometimes the most frightening thing is not what we don't know, but what we choose not to see. What followed the truth was not resolution, but reckoning. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, constrained by systems that had never been designed to repair what had been lost. The idea of justice loomed large in conversation, but when examined closely, it felt abstract and insufficient. Justice could assign responsibility, could acknowledge wrongdoing, could even deliver consequences. What it could not do was restore time or undo the quiet suffering that had filled the years between disappearance and discovery. For the family, the announcement of next steps landed with a strange hollowness. There was no rush of relief, no sense of triumph, only a steady, aching awareness that nothing ahead would give them back what mattered most. The truth had arrived too late to save, too late to protect, too late to spare them decades of waiting. Justice, whatever form it took, would exist in the shadow of that reality. Legal processes moved with a careful gravity. Every action was measured, scrutinized, weighed against precedent and procedure. Words mattered now in ways they never had before. Statements were crafted cautiously. Timelines revisited with precision. The system wanted certainty, even as it acknowledged that certainty had failed once already. Public reaction was restrained. There were no celebrations, no sense of collective closure. Instead, there was discomfort. People struggled to reconcile the long-held image of the case with the truth that had replaced it. The desire for punishment existed, but it was tempered by an understanding that punishment would not satisfy the deeper loss. Accountability did not equate to healing. The family found themselves navigating a new kind of grief. For years, uncertainty had defined their pain. Now, knowledge reshaped it. The questions that had once consumed them gave way to a different torment. The knowledge of how close the truth had been, how preventable certain moments might have been under different circumstances. That awareness carried its own weight, one that justice could not lift. Courtrooms, when they entered the picture, felt sterile and distant from the emotional reality of the case. Language flattened experience. Events were reduced to timelines and terminology that struggled to capture the magnitude of what had been endured. The family listened, absorbing details they had never wanted to know, each one carving itself into memory. The idea of closure was mentioned often, usually by those who had not lived inside the loss. It was offered gently, as if it were a gift waiting to be accepted. But closure did not exist in the way it was described. There was no moment when grief ended, no line crossed after which pain softened into something manageable. There was only continuation, reshaped by understanding. The town watched from a distance, uncertain of its role now that the mystery had shifted into something defined. Some felt vindicated. Others felt exposed. Many felt both at once. The knowledge that the truth had lived among them all along forced a collective introspection that was uncomfortable and unresolved. Justice addressed actions, but it could not erase the shared silence that had allowed those actions to go unchallenged for so long. Police departments reviewed their own histories, acknowledging missteps without fully knowing how to reconcile them. Training changed. Procedures were revised. Lessons were documented. These efforts mattered, but they existed in a future that would never touch the past. Improvement did not undo harm. It merely acknowledged it. The family was offered support, resources, recognition of their endurance. None of it felt proportional. They had spent years advocating, waiting, hoping against reason. Now, when answers finally existed, they were asked to participate in a process that still demanded patience and restraint. Even justice required them to wait. There were moments of anger that surprised them with their intensity. Anger at the truth itself. Anger at how long it had taken. Anger at a system that spoke in careful phrases while their lives had been shaped by chaos. These emotions were not explosive, but persistent, woven into the fabric of everyday life. As legal conclusions approached, expectations remained low, not out of cynicism, but realism. The family understood now that justice was not a destination. It was a step, one that acknowledged wrongdoing without pretending to repair its consequences. When outcomes were finally reached, they arrived quietly. No dramatic turning point, no emotional release, just a confirmation of what had already been known. The truth was official now, recognized and recorded. The system had done what it could, within its limits. In the aftermath, the family returned to their lives, changed but still ongoing. They carried the knowledge with them, learning how to integrate it without letting it consume what remained. They honored memory not through resolution, but through persistence, through refusal to forget, through continued presence. Justice, in the end, did not fix what had been broken. It did not restore balance or provide peace. It did something smaller and perhaps more honest. It named what had happened. It acknowledged responsibility. And it left the rest of those who had lived with the loss long before the truth ever arrived. What remained was not closure, but clarity. And clarity, while painful, allowed grief to finally exist without uncertainty. The wound did not heal, but it stopped changing shape. For the first time in decades, the story no longer waited for an ending that might never come. The motel still stands, quietly doing what it has always done. Cars pulling at night, headlights sweeping across the same stretch of pavement where everything once changed. Doors open, doors close. Luggage rolls across concrete. People check in, tired and distracted, thinking only about sleep and whatever waits for them the next day. Most of them have no idea what happened there, and those who do rarely speak of it. The neon sign still flickers, stubborn and imperfect, glowing against the dark like it always has. Its light spills across the parking lot in the same uneven pattern, illuminating nothing in particular. Time has softened the building's edges. Paint has been refreshed, carpets replaced, furniture updated. On the surface, the motel looks like any other stop along a long road. Ordinary, forgettable, safe. That is what makes it unsettling. Because places remember, even when people try not to. The room where the child disappeared no longer looks the way it once did. Nothing in it matches the descriptions preserved in old files and fading photographs. Different beds, different curtains, different television mounted to the wall. And yet, for those who know, the space feels unchanged. Memory does not require exact replicas. It fills in what is missing, overlays the present with the past until both exist at once. Guests sleep there sometimes. They lie awake scrolling on their phones, listening to the muted sound of traffic outside. Some wake in the middle of the night for no clear reason, unsettled by a feeling they cannot name. They dismiss it as unfamiliar surroundings, as a discomfort of sleeping somewhere new. They roll over and fall back asleep, unaware how close they are to a story that never truly ended. For the town, the motel has become a quiet landmark of remembrance, not officially marked, not acknowledged with plaques or ceremonies, just known. People glance at it a little longer when they pass. Conversations falter when it comes into view. It exists in the background of everyday life, a reminder woven so tightly into the landscape that it no longer draws attention until it does. Children grow up hearing fragments of the story, never the full thing. Adults lower their voices when they mention it, as if volume alone could disturb something that has been resting uneasily for decades. The disappearance has become part of the town's identity, not as a headline, but as an undercurrent, a lesson absorbed rather than taught. The family visits sometimes, though never without hesitation. Standing there brings back everything at once, the hope, the panic, the years of waiting. The truth has given them clarity, but it has not softened the edges of memory. If anything, it has sharpened them. Knowing what happened does not make the place easier to face. It makes it heavier. They stand quietly, often saying nothing. There is nothing left to ask of the building, no answers it can give. Still, they come because memory demands acknowledgement, because love insists on presence. The motel does not respond. It never has. Police files are now complete. Boxes are labeled and stored. Reports finalized. The case has an ending on paper, a conclusion that fits within the language of systems and law. But endings like that are illusions. Stories like this do not conclude. They settle. They linger. They change shape, but they do not disappear. For investigators who work the case in its later years, the motel remains a reminder of humility, of how easily certainty can blind, of how silence can be mistaken for emptiness. They drive past it sometimes, feeling the weight of lessons learned too late to matter for this child, but not too late to matter for others. That knowledge is both comfort and burden. The town has moved on, the way all places eventually do. New faces fill old houses. Businesses change hands. The rhythm of life reasserts itself. But something has shifted permanently. Parents are more careful now. Doors are checked twice. Trust is no longer automatic. Safety is no longer assumed. These changes are subtle, almost invisible, but they endure. What remains most powerful is not the shock of the truth, but the quiet it leaves behind. The realization that the most dangerous things are not always loud or violent. Sometimes they are patient. Sometimes they are familiar. Sometimes they blend so well into everyday life that they escape notice entirely. The motel is still there, offering rest to strangers, shelter to travelers, anonymity to those passing through. It does not announce its past. It does not warn. It simply exists, carrying memory in its walls without asking anything in return. At night, when the parking lot empties and the road grows quiet, the building feels different. Not haunted in the way people imagine, but weighted, as if it holds its breath, as if it remembers the moment when everything changed and wonders endlessly why no one noticed in time. The child's name is spoken less often now, but it has not been forgotten. It lives in the space between caution and care, in the way the town watches over its children, in the way the family continues forward without letting go. Memory does not always need words. Sometimes it survives through instinct, through behavior, through quiet resolve. The story no longer waits for answers. It has them. What it waits for now is acknowledgement, not of facts, but of meaning, of what happens when assumptions go unchallenged, of how easily ordinary places can become the setting for irreversible loss. The motel will outlast most of the people who remember what happened there. One day, even a fragment of the story may fade, reduced to a line in a forgotten archive. But the impact will persist in ways that cannot be documented, in choices made quietly, in vigilance practiced without explanation, in the understanding that safety is fragile and attention matters. Nothing about the building announces its role in this story. That is its final, unsettling truth. The most haunting places are rarely marked. They blend in. They continue. They wait. And somewhere between the flicker of the neon sign and the passing of another anonymous car, the past remains present, unseen, unresolved, and unforgettable. Long after the last file is closed and the final statement is released, the story continues in a way that no investigation can document. It lives in the quiet spaces, in the moments when nothing is happening, and yet everything is remembered. It exists not as a case anymore, but as an imprint on people, on places, on time itself. There are nights when the past feels closer than it should, when memory presses forward without invitation, when the mind returns to that motel not because it wants to, but because something unresolved still lingers there. The neon light flickering against wet pavement, the hum of traffic on a distant road, the ordinary sounds that framed an extraordinary loss. These details do not fade. They sharpen with repetition. The truth, once revealed, did not dismantle the mystery entirely. It answered questions, yes, but it also exposed how much cannot be repaired. Knowing what happened does not restore what was taken. It only clarifies the shape of the absence. And absence, once understood, can feel heavier than uncertainty ever was. For the family, the years after the truth are marked by a different kind of silence. not the silence of not knowing, but the silence of acceptance without peace. They have learned that some answers arrive too late to heal, yet too early to forget. The story no longer waits a discovery, but it still demands to be carried. They speak of the child not as a memory frozen in tragedy, but as a presence that shaped their lives, in small habits, in changed priorities, in a deeper awareness of how fragile ordinary moments truly are. The love they hold has not softened with time. It has deepened, grown quieter, more deliberate. Sometimes they imagine who the child might have become, not as an exercise in sorrow, but as an act of honor. Possibilities unfold briefly in thought, then are gently set aside. They know now that imagining cannot change reality. But remembering ensures the story does not collapse into anonymity. The town, too, continues its slow evolution. Streets are repaved. Stores change hands. Children grow up without knowing the full weight of what once happened there. History recedes naturally, as it always does, but fragments remain, in warnings spoken with unusual seriousness, in an instinctive caution that doesn't fully belong to the present moment. There are people who still drive past a motel and feel something tighten in their chest without fully understanding why, a sensation without language, a recognition without context. Trauma has a way of echoing beyond direct memory, shaping behavior in ways that resist explanation. The motel itself remains indifferent. Buildings do not mourn. They do not remember the way people do. And yet they hold space. They witness. They endure. The walls have absorbed laughter, exhaustion, arguments, dreams, and one night of irreversible loss. They offer no commentary on any of it. Guests come and go. Some sleep deeply. Some lie awake, listening to the sounds of unfamiliar places. None of them know they are passing through a story that once fractured lives. None of them feel the weight that others still carry. And that is not cruelty. It is simply the way time works. There is a temptation to believe that once the truth is known, the story ends. That knowledge creates a clean line between past and future. But stories like this resist clean endings. They taper instead, fading slowly into reflection rather than resolution. The haunting part is not what happened, but how quietly it happened, how easily it blended into the fabric of normal life, how long it took to be understood. This is what unsettles those who revisit the story years later. Not the act itself, but the conditions that allowed it to go unnoticed for so long. The case becomes a lesson passed forward, not formally but instinctively. A reminder that safety is not guaranteed by familiarity. That vigilance is not paranoia, but awareness. That ordinary places can hold extraordinary consequences. The police who worked the case carry it differently now. Some remember it as a turning point, others as a regret. It altered how they approached their work, how they listened, how they questioned assumptions. It taught them that the most dangerous errors are not malicious, but comfortable. In quiet moments, some still revisit the early days of the investigation, wondering what might have changed if they had looked differently. These thoughts do not seek redemption. They seek understanding. And understanding, even when painful, has value. The story does not ask for fear. It asks for attention. It asks people to notice what is overlooked, to question what feels too familiar to examine, to recognize that silence is not always absence. It is sometimes presence waiting to be acknowledged. Years from now, the details may blur. Dates may be forgotten. Names may fade from common knowledge. But the essence of the story will remain intact. A child disappeared from a place that promised safety. The truth waited decades to be seen. And when it changed how everyone understood what had happened. The haunting truth is not confined to one motel, or one town, or 1 year. It exists wherever assumptions replace scrutiny, wherever routine dulls awareness, wherever people believe that what feels safe must be safe. At night, when the world grows quieter, when distractions fade, these truths surface most clearly, in reflection, in memory, in the recognition that some stories do not end, they settle. And so the story remains, not as a warning shouted into the dark, but as a quiet presence beneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting, remembered, never fully at rest.